Sam Harris in California. Welcome to Hard Talk.
Happy to be here. Thanks, Stephen.
Sam, you have an extraordinarily popular podcast in which you talk with leading intellectuals across the world, but you also express your own trenchant opinions in a host of books that you've written. Which is more important, more meaningful to you, the conversation or expressing your strong opinion?
Good question. I think I kind of split the difference there because, as you know, I don't do much in the way of standard interviews. I'm really trying to have a conversation every time I do a podcast. So I take up probably 40% of the bandwidth in any interview. So it really is. I get to hear myself talk to my heart's content. And perhaps to the exasperation of certain guests.
When you choose guests for the Making Sense podcast, which is listened to by millions of people across the world, do you like to bring people in with whom you know you disagree and disagree really quite profoundly? Occasionally,
yeah. I mean, a little of that goes a long way. I mean, depending on how profound the disagreements are. But I think what's important is to be able to talk about substantial issues and significant differences of opinion in a way that's civil and that converges on some kind of solution. I mean, I think the only tool we have for making intellectual and moral progress is conversation, and it's persuasion. If we can't persuade one another based on argument and evidence, we really in the end, we have no appeal but to force, or force of numbers, or it's just it really, we shed the veneer of civilization pretty quickly, and so I really do view conversation as a kind of sacred tool.
I'm just wondering why you have such faith in conversation and dialogue when it seems to me we live in an era of digital communication where frankly, exchange of views and information is easier than ever before, and everybody can put their opinion out there on a platform. And yet, far from easing humanity's ability to get along, it seems to be polarizing, dividing, and creating an ever more toxic environment. So your faith in conversation may be misplaced.
Yeah, I didn't say I was an optimist. I'm not. I just think I see no alternative. Right, I think it's literally the only tool we have. There is simply no other way to influence the thoughts and opinions and behaviors and intentions of other human beings. And so, but I'm quite worried that we have created a kind of psychological experiment, that we've run on all of humanity or most of humanity all at once without anyone's consent, wherein we've created a circumstance where people can be successfully isolated with respect to certain kinds of dogmas. They can pursue any crazy idea to their heart's content, for year after year and find support for it online. The internet is having this dual function of allowing us to get access to really the totality of human knowledge instantaneously, but it's also allowing our sense-making to shatter and our epistemology to allow for a kind of balkanization of thought.
I want to turn to perhaps one of the most contentious debates, frankly, tearing America apart right now, that is race and racism, and how to respond to what many people appears to be the clear evidence of discrimination at every level in American society, including policing and the justice system. You have spoken out against Black Lives Matter. You seem to regard it as a form of identity politics, which you say is a poison in America today. Why do you say that?
Well, first let me say that I acknowledge that racism is still a tremendous problem in certain parts of American society and globally, and that racism is something that we absolutely have to oppose and criticize. And it is a problem for which there is a remedy, and we have been pursuing this remedy for many decades in the U.S. But we've made a lot of progress, right? And we're now living at a moment where we are having a kind of moral panic advertised to us, and Black Lives Matter is one of the names of this movement, and one of the groups. It's a very loose group, but it's one of the groups that is making the most noise on this topic at the moment. And it's as though we have made no progress. It's as though this moment in American history exemplifies the worst symptoms of racism, and that's quite delusional. I mean, obviously, we have made a tremendous amount of progress. Obviously, this is one of the least racist moments in human history, generally, globally, and in American history. And
But may I stop you just
please.
to point out that the obvious, that you sit with me, we're both, let's be honest, white, middle-class, comfortable, educated people who represent perhaps the dominant grouping in our respective societies. And who are you, in the end, to tell Black Americans how they should feel right now? Because so many of them look around the reality of their own lives, their children's lives, and see a system which is systemically racist, not least when it comes to the police. And they feel it is their right and their duty to express a level of anger, frustration, and an unwillingness to accept that, which is surely understandable.
Well, it's in part understandable. I mean, what is really understandable is that there is a lot of misinformation and misunderstanding being amplified. I mean, so if you're going to be outraged over the racist behavior of racist cops, or the racist consequences of systems that promulgate racism, whether there's any actual living racists around to implement those systems.
Well, it's not a choice, is it? We are surely duty bound to be outraged by that.
I'm as concerned and as outraged as anyone is about those things, but I'm doubly or additionally concerned that we not find racists where they don't exist. Right, that if you're going to find racists everywhere, you're going to find the real racists nowhere. Right, I mean, you're going to do an immense harm in the process. And so, to take the variable of police violence is very important if you're going to worry about the consequences of racism and the way it's causing Black men preferentially to get shot and killed in America. You have to find out whether, in fact, that's happening, right? Whether, in fact, Black men are being shot in greater numbers, right, in proportion to the numbers of encounters they have with police officers, and if they're having more encounters with police officers per capita, there's any explanation for that other than racism, right? My concern currently in America is that any disparity you find, whether it's with respect to police violence or employment or wealth or any variable of interest and of great social importance, currently on the left, anywhere you go left of center politically, the only explanation that is acceptable, and this really does have the quality of a kind of blasphemy test in a religion, the only explanation that is acceptable at this moment is white racism or systemic racism. Now, on the point of police violence, it just so happens that the only data we have suggest that while African Americans have more encounters with the police, and I think there are obvious reasons for that, and they're actually in fact roughed up by the police more than white Americans are. They're not killed more. In fact, they're killed less than white Americans are per encounter, which is to say that if you come under the attention of the police in America and they draw their guns on you, your chances of being shot appear to be slightly higher if you're white at the moment.
But
that
hang on.
breaks everyone's expectations.
This is fascinating because it gets to the heart of your intellectual approach to lots of things. You are, I think, a self-proclaimed rationalist. You say that you are determined to be driven by the evidence, by data, by the science, not by emotion, and still less by things like religion or any other faith-based knowledge belief system. So evidence matters. But if you look across the piece, you've alighted on one piece of evidence, but surely there's an overwhelming tract of evidence about incarceration rates, what happens to black kids in schools, what happens to black people in employment, how many jobless black people there are. There is clearly a story in America of systemic discrimination, which black people are saying right now they will no longer tolerate without expressing their anger. And when you make the point you've just made, it does sound to some like you're sort of lacking a level of compassion or even emotional intelligence or ability to empathize with the situation of the other.
Well, no. Well, first of all, it shouldn't, because I'm concerned about the real suffering of real people. But we have to acknowledge that we compound that suffering when we give false notions about its actual causes, right? So if you're going to look at, and again, I'm on record every time I touch this topic, acknowledging that we still need criminal justice reform, and the war on drugs in the United States in particular has been a disaster, and it's especially been a disaster for the black community. All of those things should go without saying, and there are changes that need to be made there. But if you're going to ascribe the status quo across the board, the fact that there's the kind of wealth inequality and inequality with respect to crime and violence in American society that breaks along racial lines, if you're going to ascribe that to white racism or white race or policies that white people are not changing because they advantage them, right? You will continually stumble upon errors of great consequence, right? It is simply not the case that there are white racists with their racism producing the level of violence we see in the black community in the inner city, in a place like Chicago.
The point that many black Americans are making right now, and I'm going to quote to you the words of just one, Sincere Carabo, who works as the social justice coordinator at the American Humanist Association. He's addressed your podcasts on this issue, your interviews with other people on this issue, and he says, Sam Harris's definition of racism places an underlying emphasis on intention, and he says that's how Sam Harris defines the number of white people who are racist as a tiny, tiny minority. However, says Mr. Carabo, when discussing racism, it is important to remember it isn't about intent, it's about impact, and in that sense it involves a far greater proportion of the white community.
Well, as stated, I wouldn't necessarily disagree with that. Intention isn't the only thing that matters, obviously. If there are policies that in effect create racist outcomes, whether anyone intends it or not, we should figure out what those policies are and we should change them, right? So that is what people tend to mean by systemic racism or institutional racism. And I'm completely on board with the project of discovering that and correcting for it, right? But what we have now in American society are allegations of racism or the experience that people are having, millions of people are having simultaneously of watching a video of, let's say, a police shooting. In the prototypical case, it'll be a white cop shooting a black
we don't have to imagine
suspect.
it, Sam. We see it. Right now we're watching over and over Jacob Blake being shot in Wisconsin. We don't have to use our imagination.
I would tell you that video is not evidence in and of itself. That video is not evidence of racism, right? You can see videos of white people being shot in precisely the same circumstances, and we have a massive problem of guns in our society. We have a massive problem of poorly trained cops. That video in particular evinced several of these problems. One is that when someone rushes to their car in defiance of police commands and opens the door and reaches in American society, unlike in the UK, it is only rational for the cops to assume that person is retrieving a gun so he can turn around and start shooting cops in the face, which happens, right? And every cop knows this.